Welcome to Know Your Food, the podcast where we explore the world of food by speaking with farmers, makers, entrepreneurs, and experts who are reshaping how we think about what we eat. I'm your host, Michael Ray Robinoff, CEO and co-founder of Farm to People, and we're recording these conversations live from our warehouse in Bushwick, Brooklyn. In today's episode, I sit down with Dr. Marion Nestle, acclaimed nutritionist, food politics expert, and author of groundbreaking books like Food Politics and What to Eat. Marion has spent decades exposing how corporate interests shape our food system, from the supermarket aisle to federal policy. And in this conversation, we talk about everything from the rise of ultra-processed food and misleading health claims to lobbying, food policy, and why nutrition science is so hard to do well. Marion also shares why she's skeptical of some popular food trends and what it would really take to shift our food system toward one that prioritizes public health over profits. Thanks for tuning in to Know Your Food. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend and leave a review. And now, here's my conversation with Dr. Marion Nestle. Marion, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I've followed you for a long time. I went to NYU not for food studies, but I was also working at the farmers market. So between the farmers market and Tisch, I sort of started to become aware of you. And when I got to see you speak here, actually, about a year ago, I think, a little more than a year ago, when Chloe Sorvino published her book Raw Deal, and you were here talking, I knew I wanted to chat with you. I feel so fortunate to get to talk to such amazing visionary folks in the food world, whether they're farmers, professors, writers, bakers, you name it. I don't want to be selfish. I want to share those conversations with everyone else. And so I really appreciate you being here tonight and agreeing to do this. You're probably busier than I am.
That's true. I'm retired.
You're a catch, so I feel amazingly happy that you're here. So thank you again.
No, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
Amazing. We got to sit down a couple months ago and chat about your new book of an old book that you wrote 20 years ago. So we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of What to Eat, and you're coming out with a new book called What to Eat Now? Or is it still What to Eat?
The revised version.
The revised version.
The very much revised version.
That's what I wanted to ask. What's happened in 20 years? I feel like a lot.
A 3-year project. Yeah, it was a pandemic idea. I had this bright idea. I would take What to Eat, which I thought read pretty well, and just update it. It would probably be a 6-month project. I'd just whip it off. Oh dear, you have to be careful what you ask for. So 3 years later, I turned in the manuscript and it's even bigger. This is going to be an enormous book, a doorstop. I don't know how many pages it is because I haven't read the galleys yet, but surely more than 600. And I did it all myself, and everything got rewritten. I used a few things from the previous edition, but very, very little.
So give us a little bit of a teaser. What are some of the highlights or lowlights of what's changed in the food industry?
The first thing was that every single food product that I used as an example in What to Eat in 2006 no longer exists. I had used a Haagen-Dazs frozen yogurt for, which I loved very much, as an example of how to read a food label. It doesn't exist anymore. I think I was the only person who ever bought it. And but the big changes are plant-based meats, CBD, edibles. When I wrote What to Eat in 2006, there were full aisles of supermarkets devoted to sugar-sweetened beverages, Coke on one side, Pepsi on the other. Now it's all flavored waters of one kind or another. I could say 20 years ago that if you wanted to avoid junk food, all you had to do was walk around the outside periphery of the store because that's where all the real food was. That's no longer true. Supermarkets have figured out if they put ultra-processed foods in and among the real foods, people will buy more of them. The principles are the same, but the details are really different, and so different that it required just absolutely redoing absolutely everything. I couldn't believe how much work it was. And then the publisher wanted more. Yes, we want a chapter on CBD edibles. Yes, we want a chapter on pet food. I hadn't done one on pet food, and so there's a lot of new chapters, and they wanted it all reorganized. They wanted all the didactic information taken out, which I had scattered throughout the book. They wanted it all at the beginning, so I did that.
Not that the book needs to be longer, but as you're talking, I'm sort of thinking, and I'm curious, maybe it's already in the book, but when you think about the consolidation of food in the past 20 years, what percentage of the supermarket was owned by what percentage of companies 20 years ago, and what that looks like today?
I did it piece by piece. I designed the book to talk about food issues using supermarkets as an organizing device. So I go aisle by aisle around the supermarket and talk about the issues that arise there. And I covered them all. And I should say there are two books, because this book had a baby, which was a big surprise to me. The book is being published by Farrar Straus, a very fancy publisher, and they have imprints, and one of their imprints is Picador. Picador is doing a series of 5 books on oceans, rivers, and streams. And they took the fish chapters, they duplicated the fish chapters that are in What to Eat Now, and put them as a separate book called The Fish Counter. And it's coming out in June with a really lovely cover, and these 5 books are a lovely series. I mean, it's really going to be nice to have that. So that was kind of a surprise. No, I got another book out of that. So it's coming out in June, and then the big one is coming out in November.
Incredible. Both this year?
Yes, both this year. I've read the galleys on the fish book, so the fish book is done, and I'm completely finished with it. The other book, I still have to read the galleys. If any of you are fantastic, completely compulsive proofreaders, and you'd be willing to read one section, let me know, because I need 1 million readers.
We've got my proofreader here, my mom, and she's incredible.
Can I borrow your mother?
Yeah, you got
a
more. We'll introduce you. Anyway, let's get back to food. I want to go back to your relationship to food. Before you can even really remember food as a career, what was food like growing up in your house?
I can't remember a thing about it. I mean, it's kind of amazing, actually. I remember nothing about my mother's cooking, except for an apple pie that she occasionally made that was really quite delicious. You know, it was war years. I grew up during the Second World War, and there wasn't much food, and it wasn't very good. And I grew up in New York. The vegetables that we had were canned. They were horrible. I really didn't know what food tasted like or care about it until I went to a summer camp in Vermont, where the camp was run by people who had lived in China and had learned to cook Chinese really, really well. And they had an enormous kitchen garden, a really big one. And if you were a good camper, they would send you out to the garden to pick vegetables for dinner, and it was my turn to do that. And, I had this absolute epiphany. I was picking string beans. It was July. I was picking string beans, and I ate one, and I was stunned. It was warm from the sun. It was sweet. It was crisp. It was absolutely delicious. And I thought, oh, this is what vegetables are supposed to taste like. And I had never had that experience. I'd eaten things that were canned and salted and whatever. Processed food wasn't very good in those days. So that was kind of the revelation. And then I got really interested in food. It turns out I really like food. I love to eat. And when I got handed a nutrition course to teach, I was on my first teaching job. It was like falling in love, and I've never looked back. It was just so great to teach.
And when did you study nutrition? Or
No, I'm completely self-taught, and that has good things and bad things about it. My doctorate is in molecular biology. I was trained as a basic scientist, and I was teaching in a biology department at Brandeis University outside of Boston. I was teaching cell and molecular biology, and it was very abstract. And the biology department, they had this rule where you could only teach the same course 3 times. Then you had to switch to something else because they never wanted their instructors to get stale. And the second rule was you had to teach anything that the department wanted, whether you knew anything about it or not. And so the students were clamoring for human biology. They were just as tired of abstract molecular biology as I was, I guess. So they wanted a human biology course. The department offered me human physiology or human nutrition, and I picked nutrition.
Incredible.
Because I was kind of interested. It was the mid-1970s. Francis Moore Lappé had published Diet for a Small Planet. Linus Pauling had just written Vitamin C and the Common Cold. The Center for Science in the Public Interest, the advocacy group in Washington, had just been started, and they had published a book called Food for People, Not for Profit, which was a book of small articles from the press about every issue you could think of, from food production to consumption. Fabulous book. It could have been written yesterday. The issues haven't changed at all. And I used all those as texts in my first class. I had about 50 students, and I asked them to pick some idea about nutrition, like vitamin C in the common cold, or maybe we should pick a contemporary example. How about vitamin A and measles? So they would go to the library and read all the literature on vitamin A and measles, and then write a paper about their review of the literature, what it meant, whether they thought the case had been made, and whether they would change their own diet. That was the paper assignment as a result of what they read. Well, so I had 50 papers at the end of that first semester, and they were all the same. They said, the research is terrible. There isn't enough of it. It's too short. It uses too few subjects. The experiments aren't very well controlled. There's this problem, there's this problem, there's this problem with them. And at the end of it, we really can't come to any conclusion, but we're going to take vitamin C anyway. So I thought, oh, isn't this interesting? I've just learned a lot about nutrition research from these students who were very good. Students in those days could do literature reviews and write papers. Very impressive, actually. And I had 50 papers on probably 30 different topics. And at the end of it, there was this emotional attachment to the nutrient and a belief system that had nothing whatsoever to do with science. I thought that was really interesting, and I was off and running. I've never looked back.
I think that's so interesting to think about how you've said that about. So, and if you look behind who's funding some of these studies, so much of, I guess, like our belief system about what is healthy or unhealthy comes from reading it, not necessarily being based on fact. So some of these like Pepsi-funded or Big Ag-funded studies will often take a side while not funding the other side, right? And so whether or not there is another side sort of becomes an unimportant side effect, right? And you just sort of push the agenda that you want to push.
There's a reason for that. The research is really hard to do. I can't just divide you into 2 groups and lock you up in one place and lock you up in another and feed you some kind of diet that I want to study and see what happens in 10 years. I don't think you'd be very happy about that. And we're not allowed to do studies on prisoners anymore, although in those days they were still doing that. You can't do studies on prisoners, you can't do studies on hospitalized patients, you can't do studies on kids. I mean, there are all kinds of ethical rules about informed consent and people being able to agree to be subjected to these things. So everything that's known about nutrition, or a lot of things that are known about nutrition, are done indirectly through animal studies or lab studies or personal anecdote, of which we have lots. Everybody eats, so everybody has personal anecdotes. I eat this, I feel better. I eat this, it makes me feel terrible. That's anecdote, not science. To study that is really difficult. So the studies need interpretation. Interpretation depends on who's doing the interpreting. And my favorite question in nutrition is, why should we believe you? How do I know who to believe? My answer to that is me, of course. It's really difficult. And lots of people opine, lots of people come across as expert. Now we have influencers, and you don't really know what they based that on. They have very strong, forceful opinions that may or may not be based on the science. The science is difficult to interpret. It requires interpretation. So whenever I hear people making very tough pronouncements about the big one this week, somebody's come out with a review of studies on the keto diet, which doesn't have very much carbohydrate in it. It's low carbohydrate keto diet. And it's talking about how great this diet is and how terrific it is for people who have metabolic problems. Well, I think they cherry-picked the data. Well, this is a very high meat diet. They cherry-pick the data. Other people looking at these data might come to different conclusions. So how are you supposed to make sense of that? Not easily.
For sure. And I think that's a tricky thing that we all contend with in our day-to-day lives. And I guess, so you get into nutrition studies and you start to teach. At what point do you realize that the food system was designed in ways that prioritize industry interests over public health?
Yeah, it took me a long time. I had a epiphany about that too. I started out like a lot of other people being really interested in nutrients. I started teaching nutrients. I've loved every one of them. They're all different and they do different things. And then at some point it occurred to me that people don't eat nutrients, they eat food. And that food has lots of nutrients and these interact in different ways. And there are reasons why studies of food come out with results that are different from studies of supplements or something like that. Food's much more important. And then it occurred to me that individual foods, at one point I was really interested in what individual foods did. Now I think that makes no sense at all because you don't eat one food. You eat lots of different foods, and you should eat lots of different foods, and the more the merrier. But it's really hard to study diet.
Well, I have two follow-up questions to that. When you think about food types, right, do you think about juicing is bad because you should eat the whole apple and not apple juice? Talk about how the nutrient makeup of something change, or not the nutrient makeup, but what we're getting as an eater.
Yeah, if you're drinking juice, you're eating 3 of whatever. You're not eating 1 orange, you're eating 3 oranges. And you're eating it without the pulp. Mm-hmm. So 3 oranges means 3 times the sugar. But the idea is that it's to study I think the most intellectually challenging question in the field of nutrition is, what do people eat? How do you find out? How do you do studies of different kinds of diets? It's really hard. And lots of people criticize nutrition research, but they can never come up with a better way of doing it than people are doing it now. And nobody's figured out how to do that. So that leaves lots of room for differing opinions. I happen to find that interesting, but it's frustrating. And I'll just say that I think what a healthy diet is so easy to explain that the journalist Michael Pollan can do it in his famous 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And really that takes care of it.
Another icon who recently passed away, Joan Gussow, mentioned what I think is interesting. She brought up about nutrition, the part before, she called it before the swallow. So what happened? What is the nutrient density of a particular item before you eat it? This is where I'm particularly interested as someone who's talking to farmers, talking about soil, talking about the health of the whole ecosystem before you even come up with that orange. I'm curious, how in your studies over the years, especially as American farmland and how we grow things and what we spray things with has changed so much. Where is that now affecting nutrition?
Well, there's quite a bit of evidence that crops don't have the amount of nutrients now that they did 50 years ago. I'm a little skeptical of that research, and I'm very uncomfortable talking about it, even though there's quite a bit of evidence, because I don't think the baseline data are comparable to the data now, and I just don't know how you do that kind of comparison unless you could find frozen food from 50 years ago And then there would be some deterioration of things like vitamin C or folate, but a lot of the nutrients would remain, and then maybe you could compare. But I think those comparisons are very difficult. Plants make their own vitamins. They synthesize their own from whatever they get, but the mineral content might be different. It's hard to know.
I've read those same studies. It's interesting to consider.
I'm not sure how to interpret them. So.
And maybe who's writing those studies? The same see above statement, who's writing this?
I should make a comment about your comment about who funds the studies, because until the early 1990s, you didn't really know who paid for the studies unless the authors of scientific articles thanked their sponsors in some way, but they weren't required to. And then starting in the 1980s, major journals began to require authors to disclose who had paid for the studies and whether they had conflicted interests, financial relationships with the funder. And that made it much easier to look at that. And on my blog, foodpolitics.com, every Monday, I post the industry-funded study of the week, each one more hilarious than the next, because I can tell from reading the title of a study who must have funded it. And if I know who funded it, I know what the results were. There's something wrong with that picture. Mm-hmm. I was trained in science, and we had beaten into us that you needed to always account for what you hadn't thought about in designing the study to be able to control the study for these kinds of unconscious biases that people have. I wrote a book about food industry funding of nutrition research. It's called Unsavory Truth. And it's got lots of examples, and then I post one every Monday.
Talking about money and food, which is you've also been very vocal about the power of lobbies. I think that's something that is tangential to these studies, right? But this is even going a step deeper, which is what legislation gets passed, what marketing to kids. I think cereal being one of the worst things that we sort of grow up eating, and even
that's my next book.
Cereal?
Yes.
Serial killer?
Yeah. No, I think it's called Sugar Coated.
Sugar Coated.
Okay. It will come out in 2026.
I'm pre-ordering it now. Talk to me about government subsidies, the power of lobbies, and also, I guess, what we're seeing in the current climate around that. I have been following your daily snapshots. The really interesting perspective you're bringing to the conversation, which I think is great.
Well, we're at a very interesting moment in food politics. Don't know what to make of it. Lobbyists. The difference between advocates, advocacy and activists are words on the forbidden list now. If you're writing a grant or writing a paper and you want to get federal funding, you can't use those words. Women is another one that's on that list. It's kind of amazing. You can't make this stuff up. The companies pay lobbyists. This is the thing that you have to understand. The lobbyists are extremely well paid by the companies that hire them, and their full-time job is to make themselves known to members of Congress so that no member of Congress ever even thinks about passing or proposing a law that might hurt that company's bottom line. Very simple goal. When I was writing Soda Politics, my book about the soda industry, there are websites that talk about who does the lobbying and for whom. And Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and the American Beverage Association together in that era, which was 2015-16, were funding 67 lobbyists in Washington. And each lobbyist visited each member of Congress several times during the year. And what lobbyists do is they present information to Congress or to congressional staff. So if you're a congressperson and you've got some complicated law, the Farm Bill, for example, which is the most complicated thing in the world, and somebody gives you an information sheet on some program in the Farm Bill, you're going to be grateful for that because it's going to do your work for you. I once taught a course on the Farm Bill. It was not my best teaching experience. The students got really tired of hearing me say, nobody could possibly understand this. But it's true. And it's not just milk marketing orders, and Rick wasn't kidding about milk marketing orders. They're really incomprehensible. I could never understand them. And I wrote an article about it called The Farm Bill Makes Me Crazy, which was published in Politico. I asked a woman who was a staff member for the Senate Agriculture Committee if she would come and speak to the class about how she had learned about the Farm Bill. She had worked for the Agriculture Committee for 8 years. She was a staff person for Sherrod Brown from Ohio. She said it was really very simple. We had lobbyists come, and the lobbyists would come and talk about the particular program that they cared about. And she said, after 8 years, I knew about a lot of programs. She learned about the Farm Bill from lobbyists. Nobody knows more about the Farm Bill than lobbyists, although lobbyists only know their little piece of it. And, it's 800 or 900 pages in the Federal Register. It's not trivial. So that's what we're up against.
Is it true even that, and I think I know the answer, but that companies will present a bill to a senator, like they'll even go that level, so they'll write it.
They'll write it, absolutely.
So they'll first write the bill, go to a senator, the senator will bring that bill, then they'll lobby that bill and lobby other senators. Mm-hmm. So it goes deeper than even the lobbying of bills. It's not like these senators are coming up with the bills.
I'm writing this book about cereals now, and it's a history of food and nutrition policy in the United States using cereal boxes as illustrations because I've collected cereal boxes for years. I collect the ones that have really hilarious health claims or, make really just such outlandish statements, and I'm working on a section about how Kellogg in 1985 wrote a book-length petition to the Food and Drug Administration making an argument for health claims on food packages. Prior to 1990, food packages weren't allowed to have health claims on them, and then Congress passed the Nutrition Labeling Act in 1990, which not only allowed health claims, but forced the FDA to start approving health claims, and they used precisely the language that Kellogg had written in its petition. So essentially, Kellogg wrote the section in the Nutrition Labeling Act in 1990 that permitted health claims on food packages. So I've got cereal boxes that have immunity banners in the front, or things about if you eat this, your child will be smarter, or the heart disease claims, the cholesterol claims, all of those kinds of things.
Well, following like what we've done, and I believe even they came out about alcohol for this, but like cigarettes, right? We've now decided to put some crazy infected lung on a pack of cigarettes, and it's supposed to scare us. Should we be doing that on a box of cereal?
Well, I'm just back from Mexico, and walking into a Mexican supermarket is an astonishing experience because every other product has great big fat black warning labels on them saying they're high in salt, sugar, saturated fat, calories, artificial sweeteners, or caffeine.
Well, an American supermarket would look no different.
I brought back 5 cereal boxes, and I'm a little obsessed. And the ones that I brought back were examples of how cereal companies are evading the Mexican warning label law, because if the warning labels are on the box, they're not allowed to have cartoons. So that's one of the rules. And the last time I was in Mexico, there were cartoons because they had artificial sweeteners, but then Mexico got the law passed that included artificial sweeteners. But I saw sweetened cereal with a cartoon on it, and that was because they found an artificial sweetener that hadn't been mentioned in the law, allulose, and so they are using allulose in that. And then there was one, the one with the cereal with the toucan on it, Fruit Loops. And so they had Fruit Loops where they weren't allowed to have a cartoon on it, but they had marshmallows in the Fruit Loops, and the marshmallows were in the shape of the toucan, so they had a marshmallow blown up on the front.
That was their workaround, to get the cartoon on there.
That was the workaround.
We're just displaying what the product is.
Yeah. I mean, food companies want to sell food.
Yeah.
That's what they're about.
Quick allulose segue, because it's a hot topic, and whether it's Magic, I think it's Magic Spoon uses allulose, but they claim to be like a better for you cereal. Where is it an artificial sweetener?
It's ultra processed if it's got allulose in it.
I just wanted to set the record straight.
Sorry. Sorry.
So we talk a lot about getting...
I prefer sugar.
Yes, yes. Good old-fashioned sugar. We had Ethan Frisch, one of the co-CEOs and founders of Burlap and Barrel, which...
They have very nice sugar. Very nice sugar.
Yeah. It's a lot to... It would make your cereal very, very expensive, but probably quite nutritious. So we talk about money in politics a lot, and I think we see the problems that come from that in an election like the one we just had, and it's not going to get any better. But I want to go into food specifically, food politics. We just talked about all the lobbying, all of the money in food politics. How do you restructure the food industry in a way that's not just profit-driven, but driven by human health?
Sorry. Sorry. Lots of people have tried. They have failed.
Why?
Because we have an investment system that requires not only profit, but growth in profit. And that investment system started in 1981. I can date it to the speech given by Jack Welch, who was head of General Electric, who picked up Milton Friedman's idea that the only purpose of a corporation is to make money for stockholders, and he gave that speech, and everybody bought it. So the only purpose of a corporation is to make money for stockholders. Corporations should do nothing that interferes with that goal, and absolutely should do nothing about community, social service, social interactions, society, and those are irrelevant goals. And Wall Street bought it. And so that was a situation in the early 1980s. The number of calories in the food supply was already rising very rapidly, and it went from about 3,000 calories a day per capita in 1980 to about 4,000 in 2000, so an increase of nearly 1,000 calories a day, plenty to account for. People started eating more because the food industry had to sell food in a really competitive environment. They put food where food never was before, libraries. The NYU library, when I first came to NYU in 1988, had signs all over it. If you bring food into this library, you're out of NYU, period, end of story. You know, we don't want cockroaches. I remember there were posters of cockroaches on books. No food in the library. Now there's a cafe in the library. There are vending machines all over the place. Bookstores? You weren't allowed to bring food into bookstores. Coffee in bookstores? Out of the question. You might get coffee on the books.
Starbucks and Barnes & Noble.
Well, that has changed.
Yeah.
And then larger portions. And I had a doctoral student who documented the rise in portion sizes that occurred during the 1980s and actually was able to do a graph of the trend towards larger and larger portions. And, you know, as a nutritionist, if I had one thing that I would like everybody to know, it's that larger portions have more calories.
Yeah.
You laugh, but it's not intuitively obvious.
Very true, and also like at the end, it's caloric intake and caloric, you know, what you burn in a day is really a math problem, and you need to balance that.
It's thermodynamics.
I like listening to his perspective, especially given the current climate on things. He may not be that popular even in this room, but I thought it was really interesting when it came to food. Bill Maher said something really interesting, which was when I was a kid, we had a sandwich for lunch, and then we had to wait all the way until dinner. There wasn't a thing called snacking. If I was hungry, my parents would be like, here's an apple, like a whole apple. And I think somewhere, and if you, the Expo West, if you look at like soda, Poppy selling to better soda with allulose, maybe, but one of them I believe has.
It's just been bought by Coca-Cola, I think.
Pepsi. Popsy, they're calling it. But like this whole idea of snacking, obviously snacking culture.
Well, that happened in the 1980s. The food industry promoted snacking, produced research that demonstrated that people who snacked were thinner than people who didn't, which is wrong because the more times a day you eat, the more calories you take in. That's a rule. And, snacks became everywhere and everybody loves them. And so I don't know what happened to meals, but I remember, if you had lunch and then there was dinner 5 hours later. Tough on you if you were hungry. It wouldn't hurt to go back to some of that.
Yeah, totally. When you think about policy changes that are looming, related to food and agriculture, there's also a lot that is very worrisome. When Rick mentioned some of the insane policies that exist today, potentially even with government inefficiency.
Unfixable.
Full stop.
Yeah,
Next question.
Without a revolution. Unfixable.
What does a revolution look like?
Well, it depends on whose revolution it is.
Yours.
Mine? I would completely change the food production system to food for people instead of animals and cars. The Department of Agriculture produces this astounding graph of what happens to the 12 billion bushels of corn grown in the United States every year. 45% goes to animals, 45% goes to ethanol for cars, maybe more than 45%. And there's a tiny fraction left over, less than 10%, that goes for food for people, although most of that goes for high fructose corn syrup and ingredients and other things like that. So essentially, none of the corn that's grown in the United States feeds people. That's crazy, right? That's on top of what we're doing about dairy foods. This is crazy. So I would change that.
I would too.
I would support small, medium farmers producing real food.
Yeah, so when you think about what is subsidized, it's mostly food for animal feed or not even food, let's call it ethanol. And animal feed. Okay, so if anyone's driven across the country.
And soybeans are used for diesel.
Yeah, and when you drive across the U.S., it's pretty boring. It's pretty much corn and soybeans. So, and yet, when you read older books about the soil in the Midwest, it was some of the most amazing, richest soil in the world. How do we, through subsidy, and maybe this is where a revolution could happen, a revolution for positive change, could you get back to a world where we're subsidizing farms still to grow things, because they are getting, they're too afraid now to wean themselves off of corn and soybeans, because even though they're not getting paid enough to grow that, they're getting paid something, and it's a guaranteed market. But it doesn't benefit human eaters.
The insurance system makes sure that everybody makes a living. The business about get bigger, get out was a policy from the 1970s, and it's had terrible effects. There's lots of talk about regenerative farming and farming in ways that restore the soil. And, I'm in favor of organics, especially small organics. I think there's a lot that we could do, and it's being done in small places. It's being done everywhere, but not at scale.
Not at scale, and not in a way that people, I think, value the cost difference. And I think that's something we struggle with. People are like, oh, you're expensive. Right. You're a grocery store for the elite. It's bougie. And yet, when you look at the margins that we make and the profits that we make, they're dwarfed by these food for the masses, which is just not what we're saying. It's not nutritionally food.
It's the ultra-processed foods are the most profitable foods in the supermarket.
Yeah.
And the drinks.
Couple more questions and then we're up on time, but I could talk to you all night. One of the mayoral candidates right now, Zoran Mamdani, has put up as a thing he's running on is a municipal grocery store. So this idea that food should be a right for everyone, which in and of itself, saying it like that doesn't feel like it should be like a divisive topic. Obviously, there's going to be big business up against that. And also, like, what would the food, my question for him would be, what would the food that would end up in the municipal grocery store even be? Would it be nutritious food, or would it just be calories? I'm curious what you think, because I know you've been a voice for getting better food to more people.
I just think people need universal basic income. It would solve so many problems. They could choose their own food.
Or would that just give them enough income to get the food to keep funding? Would it just essentially be another subsidy for big ag?
It would depend on how much it was and how much they were getting. But
I bet it wouldn't be much.
But no, we did this experiment during the pandemic. It was remarkably successful that when people had more money to buy food, they bought food.
You're absolutely right, yeah.
And then Congress took it away.
Last question. Small farms, like many of the ones that we work with at Farm to People, operate with a commitment to quality and sustainability, but they face enormous challenges competing with large industrial producers. What are the biggest systemic barriers preventing small farms from thriving, and what changes need to happen to level the playing field?
The cost of land, the availability of land, the market. How do you get, the example that just leaps to mind is, because dairy products are on my mind, Danone is a B corporation. B corporations have stockholders who have agreed that profit cannot be the only goal of the corporation and that social values have to be considered. And yet when Danone announced that it was going to stop buying organic milk from small dairy farmers in the Northeast, which it had been supporting for all those years because it could get the milk easier and cheaper from Texas. Never mind that the milk has to be transported 2,000 miles. That's what you're up against.
Yeah.
It's cheaper to produce milk in Texas and Arizona and California and transport it here than it is to have it here. That's the way the system is working. These are system problems. And you hope that somebody at the Department of Agriculture will understand this. There used to be really great people at the Department of Agriculture. I don't know whether any of them kept their jobs, who think about these things and really would like to do something about it. And the Economic Research Service in the Department of Agriculture used to write terrific reports about these kinds of things, but Trump killed that agency in his first term by moving it out of Washington to Kansas. It's never recovered.
It never came back.
It's never recovered. No. Or they're not writing the same kinds of reports.
Yeah.
So,
well,
because those reports had those words in them.
Yikes.
And there are 200 of those words.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been eye-opening. I don't know if encouraging is the right word to use, but I think, to me, these are all problems that, we get to contend with and think about on a daily basis. And when we think about how, whether it's tariffs, the cost of labor, the cost of gas, all of these different things that continue to go up and how they affect our already high prices, it just feels like the cards are stacked against the smaller farms in a way that I'm acutely aware of, and I think you're acutely aware of. Not to sound like there is a simple solution, because you're probably right. The solution is probably like tearing the whole system down and rebuilding it differently.
There's some people think the system is working exactly the way it was designed to.
Yeah.
So there you are.
Well, I feel like if you don't think this...
On that cheerful note,
if you don't think the system is working exactly the way you want it to work, I think the most important thing to remember is how to vote with your food dollars. Go to the farmer's market, buy directly from farms. We try our best to be that middle conduit that helps get food from farms to people if you don't have the time to get it yourself. But I think at the end of the day, shortening that supply chain, making sure you know where that food dollar is going is the little bit we can all do.
Well, I would say, try to join organizations that are working for political change, because you can't do it on your own.
For sure. So Marion, thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
being here.
Thank you.
And sharing. Thank you for listening to Know Your Food, a podcast from Farm to People. If today's conversation got you thinking differently about what's on your plate or where it comes from, we'd love if you shared this episode with a friend or left us a review. It helps more people discover the folks reimagining the future of food from the ground up. And if you're in the New York tri-state area, you can shop from our network of small, regenerative, independent farms and makers at farmtopeople.com, and stay in the loop by signing up for our newsletter or joining us on Instagram at farmtopeople. Until next time, eat well and know your food.